cruise base. This is Lomond Queen.
Go ahead, Bev.
Shaky, we have 45 and 2, 45 and 2, Talbot run trip.
45 and 2, roger that.
Thank you.
Cheers.
I'm giving it all to you, Sue. You see right from the beginning where we radio in to see how many passengers we've got. Hope you're not bored rigid by the end of this. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard the Lomond Queen for your cruise on Loch Lomond today. My name is Bev. I'll be your skipper for the journey. And taking care of the galley is Matthew. Please listen carefully to a safety announcement as we leave the pier. Be aware that there are life jackets beneath the seats in the lower cabin, and there are 2 life rafts on this vessel, one on either side of the wheelhouse. In the event of any emergency, please look to either Matthew or myself for instructions. Now the bar is open, folks, and if you'd like to fortify yourself against this chilly rain with a hot drink, you can do that. If you're liking something a little stronger, we've got a fine selection of Lomond ales, a couple of malt whiskies, and you can even have a dash of whiskey in your coffee. We call this Rob Roy coffee. Not only will that set you up against the chill of the day, but it'll make your commentary sound a lot better. Now folks, let's start as we mean to carry on with an ideal opportunity here. As you look to the right side of the boat, down to the south of the loch, you can see through that narrow gap in the hills how the countryside changes very suddenly from the rugged mountains of the Scottish Highlands to the low rolling green hills of the Scottish lowlands. This is because you are looking across the Highland boundary fault line. This is where 2 pieces of land joined together many millions of years ago. And there are not many places in the world where the geography or geology has had such a dramatic impact on its history. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we travel around the loch. Over to our right you can see Ben Lomond just snuggling under the clouds there. Now Ben Lomond is the most southerly of all Scotland's Munros, a Munro being a mountain in Scotland that is 3,000 feet or more. Ben Lomond only just qualifies at 3,192 feet. But it has a very distinctive shape, and because it sits on that Highland boundary fault line and the land drops away to the south of here, Ben Lomond is visible from many places along the central belt, and so is probably the best known peak. Now we're going to make our way over to the eastern shore of Loch Lomond, and this was once the main thoroughfare from the north to the south for the clansmen who lived in these hills. I'll give you a chance to just charge your cups, or your glasses as you will, and settle in. I'll give you a couple more stories as we go around. Now folks, if there's anything you need or would like to know, please don't hesitate to ask either Matthew or myself. Now folks, we're making our way over the deepest part of the loch in a minute. It's 630 feet deep at the deepest point. It's 192 metres. This makes it the 3rd deepest in Scotland after Loch Ness and Loch Morar. And we have some pretty exciting fish in Loch Lomond. We have the requisite species of trout and salmon. We also have pike, perch, tench, roach, and the moray eels. Moray eels grow very large indeed in these large bodies of fresh water. In fact, we have a little song that we sing here, and that's when you swim in the creek and an eel bites your cheek, that's a moray. Anyway, but I won't be singing to you again, I can assure you, even though we're surrounded by the bonny banks. Otherwise Matthew will have me over the side. Now, if you were sailing here 400 years ago, this would have looked very different indeed. There would have been nothing at all in the way of civilization to our left, where the A82 is now. But over to our right, the eastern shore would have been bustling with activity. Now, it's important to understand that the Scottish Highlands were very much the domain of the scattered clans right up until the end of the 18th century. That Highland boundary fault line was a dividing line between accessible countryside and the rugged, impossible mountains of the Scottish Highlands. If you look at the lower shores on either side of us, you get a sense of the Caledonian forest that would once have covered most of Scotland, and certainly the Highlands. It is known as temperate rainforest because of the very high rainfall we have here. And if you get up close and personal with it, you can see it's not easy travelling among it at all. So for this reason, we had large populations between Glasgow and Edinburgh on the central belt, and also we had the west coast bustling with activity. They had their own currency and kings on the islands, and there was a brisk trade on the go. But the Highlands of Scotland was where the clans were, and very sparsely populated indeed. It's important to understand that the clans lived in what would be described as an oodle system as opposed to a feudal system. That is to say that nobody owns the land, it simply belongs to whoever lives on it. Now, there are some oodle systems still in place in parts of Scandinavia and the far north of Scotland, and this was one of the arguments during the recent Scottish referendum, where it was claimed that Scotland is much more closely affiliated with Scandinavia than it is with England. Imagine the surprise of the MacGregors then. This, incidentally, to our right is MacGregor country, and then over to our left we have MacFarlane country. To the south on the western side would have been the Colquhouns, and to the south on the east, well, that bad old Duke of Montrose. The MacGregors lived in the hills here, happily, for hundreds of years. But imagine their surprise in the 16th century when the Campbells arrived and declared that the king of the day had given them this land by way of thank you for some battle that they'd assisted him with. And the MacGregors were tickled pink at the idea of anybody owning land at all, and saw the Campbells off in no uncertain terms. This brought down on their head the status of outlaw, but it was impossible for the redcoats to implement any kind of arrest or retribution under this outlaw status. And so began a fear that was to last for hundreds of years between the MacGregors and the redcoats, and then latterly the Duke of Montrose himself. Now, we do tend to romanticise the idea of these outlaws, just as we did with Ned Kelly and Robin Hood. But the outlaw Rob Roy MacGregor, for example, could have been hunted and killed with impunity. And in fact, the outlaw Highlanders would very often be hunted with dogs. Rob Roy MacGregor, a rock star in his own time, the drovers would make a name for themselves by successfully getting a huge proportion, a significant proportion of the cattle to market. The cattle would be roaming the hills, and when the clan needed something, they would simply round up whichever cattle they could find, take them to market, and sell them for the goods that the clan needed. But getting them to market was no easy feat, and it's said that some of the Highlanders bringing the cattle from north of Rannoch Moor would put shoes on the cattle, like horseshoes, because if a cow went lame, it wouldn't make it to market, so it was worth it to them to actually shoe the cattle. If any of you have done a section of this West Highland Way, you can imagine how easy it is to sprain an ankle, never mind how easy it would be to damage a cow when you're bringing a whole herd of them through. Now, the West Highland Way is still a popular walkway, 97 miles from Glasgow through to Fort William. And people come from all over the world to do this walk in anywhere between 5 and 10 days, although it's said that somebody once did it in 3 days, one summer when the midges were particularly bad. Picture the drovers bringing their cattle along these paths then. They were not the Hieland coos, if you'll pardon my good Zimbabwean accent, that you might visualise today. The Highland cows 300 years ago that would have run among these hills were small black cattle, very hardy little creatures. And it's said that the drovers would bring oats with them for selling cattle.
Go ahead, Alex.
Of a morning they would make a big batch of porridge with some of this delicious Lomond water and the milk from one of the cows. They would make extra porridge, and in the evening draw a little blood from the ankles of one of the cows, mix it in with the porridge, make it into patties, cook it on the fire, and hey presto, you have one of the origins of black pudding. I'm going to draw in closer to the shore now, and you can get a sense of the forest that we have here. These Caledonian forests have been cleared from most of Scotland. We'll have more of a conversation about that a bit later as to how that's happened. But we have a rare opportunity to immerse yourself in the historical landscape of the country here. As we go along, you'll also get a sense of some ruins among the bracken and give you an idea that there was once a lot more activity. This whole area, of course, now is under the jurisdiction of the Lomond and Trossachs National Park. I hope this is coming okay, Sue. I've got a bit of stage fright actually, I'm bumbling through it. But I have to tell you that one of the tour guides on the first trip this morning gave me one hell of a compliment. He said it was the best commentary he'd heard. He'd been doing this for 46 years and this was the best commentary he heard. Unfortunately, he then went and told my boss, who's a bit pissed off because he's usually their skipper. But never mind. Now folks, appearing over to our left there, you can see a couple more Munros. On Ben Vorlich you have the hydroelectric power station that we'll have a closer look at a little bit later. And to the left of that we have Ben Vane and Ben Eam. Now here we're looking into the back of what's rather grandly known as the Arica Alps, so named because there are several Munros in there, and the climbers can bag a few Munros in one day. Now keep your eyes peeled for some deer on the hills. We have red, roe and fallow deer. The red and the roe are indigenous, and the fallow was introduced from Europe in the time of Robert the Bruce for hunting purposes. It's a much lighter and slighter deer, and made hunting a little bit more interesting. We also have what are fondly known as the wild mountain goats. In fact, they are not indigenous. They are the domestic mountain goats that the redcoats would turn loose whenever they decamped, and they made off into the hills and have evolved into these great shaggy brown creatures that look very much at home in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. It is said that if you're walking the West Highland Way, you're more likely to smell them first than see them. Now incidentally, I didn't tell you about our most important fish of all, and that is the powan. The powan is found in Loch Lomond and one other loch to the west of here, and nowhere else in the world. It looks a lot like a herring, and it was believed for a long time that it was a throwback to the herring that were left behind when this became fresh water. But recent research, genetic research, has begun to suggest that it might be more closely related to the Arctic char. Now bear in mind that Loch Lomond would have been gouged out by the last ice age, the most southerly reach of which was here and was known as the Lomond Advance. That was just 10,000 years ago that ice age ended, and this would have been a sea loch like all the others on the west coast. But because of the pressure of that tectonic plate, this piece of land has been lifted 20 feet above sea level, and that's why Loch Lomond is now a freshwater loch. Now folks, we're coming in towards Inversnaid Hotel here. This originated as a stabling block on the West Highland Way. You'll see why once we're the other side of the loch. It's the only place for many miles north and south where there's a dip in the hills to make it possible for the Highlanders to access the east of the country. Now it developed into a popular hotel in the 19th century, so popular even Queen Victoria came here a couple of times with Prince Albert. And of course Sir Walter Scott spent a lot of time here writing his story about Rob Roy, harvesting those stories from these hills less than 100 years after that great Highlander had died. But perhaps the visitor that I get most excited about is Gerard Manley Hopkins, the poet. Lesser known poet, but his poem called Inversnaid is hailed by many great writers as one of the greatest poems of all time. So I live in hope of finding fellow poets aboard. If you get the chance, make sure you look up that poem that talks about the Darksome Burn. Now that Darksome Burn is a pretty feisty creature today, folks. With all that rain we've had this week, the waterfall is the most dramatic I have ever seen it, so you're in for a treat here. I'll slow the boat down as we come so you can maybe get a shot or two of that. And there you have it, Inversnaid Hotel. Now look at the height of that pier, folks. In the 19th century, one of the greatest pastimes was going down the water again, if you'll pardon my good Zimbabwean accent. And Loch Lomond, the River Clyde, the Forth and Clyde Canal would all have been bristling with boats. It was, there were 2 paddle steamers on Loch Lomond, and that is why that pier is so high. One of the paddle steamers can still be seen down at Balloch. It's not running now, but there is a project to try and get that up and running again. Now we're turning our back on McGregor country here and heading over to McFarlane territory. Directly ahead of us on the slopes of Benvorlich you can see the Loch Sloy power station. This brings water from Loch Sloy. On the other side of the mountain there's a 2-mile tunnel through the hill, through the mountain should I say, and you can see from the pylons that this is attached to the national grid. In times of desperate need, such as when we are watching football or Coronation Street, then a wee boost might be called for from Loch Sloy. They open up the sluices and drop the water down onto the generators you can see behind the windows there. If you turn your eyes to the right, just in the trees on the western shore there, you can just make out the high arches of the West Highland Line. This is a train journey that you can do from Glasgow to Mallaig, and if you've never done it, get it on your bucket list. It's an outstanding journey, taking in a huge variety of scenery in Scotland, and the last time I looked it was less than £50 return, and somebody's going to find out what a gem it is and start charging an awful lot more for that one of these days. On the stretch between Fort William and Mallaig you can even see the original steam trains, and some of these were used, some of the stretches were used in the Harry Potter movies, just to give you a sense of that. Now we're a little bit ahead of schedule, folks, so I'm going to do a quick turn around McFarlane's Island, kidnapping you for the day. Can I just draw your attention up to the north of the loch there? You can see there's a beautiful bit of sunlight there, but there's a very dark mountain up to the top there. Come in, Shaky.
Yeah, we have a huge number for the robbery here. 6 plus 2, that's David Inversnade robbery.
Oh my God. Commiserations for that one, sweetie. 6 and 2. 6 and 3, is it not?
Joy. See you later. Tatty, bye now.
Cheery. Now that mountain up to the north there looks very ominous, doesn't it? Even on a sunny day, Ben Dubh manages to glower down the loch. It's aptly named. It comes from the Gaelic word dubh or dew, which is dark or hidden. And you would have heard this used in the context of the skian dew. Now, much as we might romanticise about the times of the clans in the Highlands, none of them would ever set off on any journey without a dagger hidden in the folds of their cloak. And the name of a dagger is a skian, and because it was hidden it would be dew. So the skian dew was the hidden dagger that the Highlanders would carry with them when they went about the hills. However, if they were visiting somebody and wanted to show their host that they trusted them, they would put their dagger on display. And this tradition persists today. If you see gentlemen in their Highland dress, they will have a skean dhu in their sock. Now folks, we're heading right under the shadow of the Lochsloy power station to go around MacFarlane's Island. The MacFarlane clan came to its end in the hills here before the MacGregors, because General Wade's road made its way directly through their territory. They were not able to continue subsisting in the Oodle system that they were used to. So having their livelihood removed, they had no recourse but to resort to helping themselves to goods that were being transported along General Wade's road, mostly by the Redcoats, who were heading north to quell the Jacobite rebellion. It is said that these raids would usually happen when there was a full moon, for obvious reasons. And to this day, you'll hear of the full moon in Scotland being referred to as MacFarlane's Lantern. Well, this comes from this very neck of the woods. As we come around the island, you're going to see the cutest castle you ever saw. A very small stronghold that the MacFarlanes would retreat to after their raids on General Wade's road, and the stronghold served them very well. Any keen photographers? Suggest you brave the elements, come up to the port side on the top deck, because every time we come round the island you get a competition winning photograph up the loch. And there you have it, the tiniest castle in Scotland. Now another interesting thing to see here are these fabulous Scots pines. The Scots pines were the first trees to cover Scotland after the Ice Age that ravaged the ground and left it just a bare rock. And you can see from those trees there, they're able to cling on in very shallow soil. There's some extraordinary research out that suggests that the seeds of those Scots pines actually survived the Ice Age. And I had one botanist one keen amateur botanist, should I say, who was on the boat last week, who said that in fact the Caledonian, the Scots pines are the only indigenous trees in Britain, that the rest of the seeds came from Europe. This is a fact I've yet to follow up on. About 4,000 years after the Ice Age, the temperature rose and the weather got a lot wetter, and that is when these deciduous forests stole a march on the Scots pines and established themselves across the whole of Scotland. These forests were cleared for many and varied reasons. Perhaps the best known would have been for sheep grazing. Of course, there was the cutting down of trees for domestic use and building use, which one might say would be fair enough, but there's a chilling account in a church on the east coast of Scotland where the monks proudly describe how they felled 1,200 mature oaks to make the roof of one church. Of course, on the west coast we had the boats, the boat buildings and repairs and servicing, which would have taken its toll on the trees and the islands. And the redcoats were responsible for clearing great swathes of trees in areas like this, where they were growing frustrated of trying to chase people along narrow paths. This happened extensively in Ireland too. But one of the little known reasons for the loss of trees was for charcoal. The charcoal makers would make their way into the highlands and cut down great swathes of trees, which would be stacked into what were known as charcoal houses. They were then set alight and left to burn for a few weeks, and then the charcoal hunters would come and gather in the charcoal. This was very much sought after, particularly that made from these Atlantic oaks. It was excellent for smelting iron ore, and the ships coming up the lochs on the west coast would avail themselves of this charcoal to smelt iron ore that they either brought with them or bought here in places like Furness. What nobody knew, much like the inhabitants of Easter Island, was how the countryside would struggle to re-establish its forest. And to this day you can see that much of Scotland has been left quite bare of its forest. But there are several initiatives to reintroduce forest to areas up north, and you can even take part in these if you like me, dread birthdays and Christmases because you've got everything you could ever want. You can ask your friends to buy you a tree in a Caledonian forest. I think you can get a tree planted for £6, and there are many projects up north for getting the trees re-established. You can even outline this for funerals. If somebody's not wanting flowers to funerals, you can ask them to put them towards a wee plantation of trees, and people can then visit that plantation in later years and see which trees were bought for that particular person. But there we are, on a cheerier note. We have an opportunity here to see the trees. The pines and spruce on the higher slopes were the ones planted by the Forestry Commission in more recent years. Now, if you were to come here on a winter's day, these deciduous trees would all be bare, and you would get a sense of why the countryside is difficult for the deer that roam around here. There's nothing much for the eating between the heather and the bracken, and they have a lot to answer for as far as stopping the trees that re-establish themselves. There were wolves to keep the deer population in check, but these were shot out a long time ago. And of course we now have those pesky mountain goats which do untold damage to the sapling trees, whose shoots are a handy snack to devastating effect for the little saplings. Now we're making our way back south down the loch, and I think it's time we try to find something nice to say about the English, so let me see if we can do that. Now bear in mind that these walls to our right would be nigh on 300 years old. General Wade and his redcoats. We may feel sad that the building of these roads brought not only the Jacobite rebellion, but the clan system to an end, because so many more troops could be moved up to the north. But it has to be said that the building of these roads, which went as far as Fort William, Aberdeen and Inverness, heralded the opening up of the Highlands. The roads were developed further in the 19th century by Thomas Telford, and you've got to admit they're doing a slightly better job of holding up the road than the more recent attempts by Transport Scotland that we're about to pass, and these constitute throwing rocks over the side. Now this is never going to work because the sides of the loch are sheer, and that's why the water looks so black. Obviously there's a peat stain in the water, but also the light that travels into the water simply never gets reflected back, and that's why it looks so dark. But there you are, just keep your eyes peeled on the wall. There's some beautiful construction over the next mile as we follow that wall along. Doesn't it occur to me, are there many English people in this group?
No, they're all like Aberdeen.
Are they? Oh, good. I suddenly thought I'm going to get in trouble with my saying something nice about the English comment. One of these days. Also slagging off that viewing platform. Well, Sue, I'm just telling Matthew, my steward, is in here. We've just seen a stunning photograph, which of course I don't have a camera ready for. And I was just telling him, for every decent photograph you have 47 between the lines. And there we are. There was Rodney the Balinese boxer again. And I'll have to explain that to Matthew later. Now folks, if you look to our left, we're passing a small island. And that is Tarbert Island. But it has another name locally. It's also known as Honeymoon Island because of an ancient tradition of bringing young married couples out here immediately after the wedding and leaving them here for 2 weeks. The idea being that if they survived that, they'd have a long and happy marriage. Now folks, if you look up, what should I say, down to the south of the loch on the left now, away down through that narrow gap, and you can see the sun on those low rolling green hills in the Scottish lowlands, and it really highlights the contrast between these rugged mountains that we have in the Highlands. Now, if there are any of you who travel this road regularly, just up to our right, there's a little road that you'll see in a minute that goes into a little Forestry Commission car park. It's signposted as Tarbert Isle Car Park, and it's a handy stop if you're doing that journey up north on the A82. When you park your car, you take a little road up to the left, a path up to the left, and it takes you on a high road through that Scots pine forest up there. If you follow it along, you'll come to the weavers' cottages and take another road back on a low road, and it's about a 45-minute walk. Great one for stretching the legs of dogs and children if you've got a long journey ahead of you. And of course you have a high road and a low road on the bonny banks of Loch Lomond, and the makings of a most excellent song. But I have already sung my song for today, so I will not sing again. I do have one more story for you though, as we round the point here coming back into Tarbert. You might wonder why there are so many places around Scotland called Tarbert, and you can blame the Vikings for that. The Vikings, as I'm sure you know, believed that if they could circumnavigate a piece of land, that they owned it. But they had their work cut out for them on the sea lochs on the west coast of Scotland, because they'd travel for miles up a sea loch and then come to a headland. But undaunted, they would find a place like this where there was a narrow, low stretch of land, and they could carry the boat across, or pull the boat across, and drop it into the next stretch of water, which they would have done here, sailing down to Balloch and out onto the River Clyde, so circumnavigating the piece of land in front of us. And the word Tarbert then comes from the Old Norse for pull boat, Tarbet. Extraordinary then, we have so many different ideas of how people think they can own the land, all in this tiny stretch of Scotland. Now folks, we're just making our way back into the bay. I'm sorry if I've made you a few minutes late, but I couldn't resist doing McFarlane's Island just there. All that remains is to thank you on behalf of Matthew and myself for sailing with us on Loch Lomond today. I hope you have a sunny trip wherever you're heading to next, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much. Over and out, McNally. Let me know what you think of that. Bye.